I never thought a quiet suburban street could feel like a battlefield. Until the HOA Karen next door decided my property wasn't really mine. One morning, I woke up to find a notice claiming she had plans to expand the neighborhood onto my land. Fences were drawn, fines were stacking up, and suddenly, my home felt like enemy territory. Every interaction with her was a test of patience. Every phone call a trap. I knew I couldn't back down, but I had no idea just how far this would go. How far would she push before I fought back? And what would I have to do to stop her? Life on Cedarwood Lane was exactly what I'd imagined when I bought my little house 5 years ago. Quiet mornings with birdsong, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over white picket fences. My home wasn't just a house. It was where weekends smelled like fresh, baked bread, and the backyard was our sanctuary for barbecues, late night stargazing, and the occasional garden experiment gone wrong. We knew our neighbors by name, exchanged waves, and thought we'd found the perfect bubble of suburban peace. But even in paradise, tension can creep in quietly, unnoticed at first. That first hint came when I received a glossy newsletter from the HOA announcing new community enhancements and reminding everyone to keep their lawns perfectly manicured. Nothing alarming, just a polite suggestion on the surface. I skimmed it and thought nothing of it until the subtle digs began. Offhand remarks about my untity flower bed from a neighbor I barely knew. A comment dropped at a block meeting about property lines and aesthetics. It seemed trivial at first, like polite corrections in a fastidious neighborhood. Still, there was something in the tone, a hint of ownership, a quiet insistence that everyone obeyed the unwritten rules of this little enclave. That quiet insistence, I would later realize, was the opening salvo in what would become a battle I never expected. I didn't know yet that one neighbor had started eyeing my backyard like a chessboard, moving pieces behind the scenes to make her vision of the perfect neighborhood expand into my life. I loved this place, but that love hadn't prepared me for the storm that was coming. And when the first official notice appeared on my door, I realized this wasn't just about a lawn or a fence anymore. It was about my home, my property, and a neighbor who would stop at nothing to bend the rules in her favor. It started with small, almost imperceptible pushes. The first official warning from the HOA arrived like a dark cloud on an otherwise sunny morning. I remember opening the envelope, expecting a routine newsletter or perhaps a friendly reminder about community events. Instead, it was a typed notice, carefully worded, claiming that my backyard violated neighborhood aesthetics standards and needed to be corrected immediately. My backyard, where my kids played, where we hosted barbecues and garden parties, was suddenly under scrutiny. I reread the notice, convinced I had misunderstood. But no, the language was precise, cold, and unequivocal. At first, I tried to reason with the HOA board. I attended meetings, spoke politely, and even offered to make minor adjustments. But every attempt to comply seemed to only invite more scrutiny. New rules emerged almost weekly. Flower beds had to follow a rigid color palette, fences had to be painted a specific shade, and no decorative lighting was allowed after dusk. Each rule was a trap, a way to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. Every attempt to ask questions was met with curt responses, veiled threats, or the passive, aggressive commentary of certain board members. It was during one of these early confrontations that I first noticed her. Karen. She was the neighbor who seemed to take an almost personal interest in every detail of my property. If a bush leaned slightly to the left, she noticed. If my lawn had a single patch of wildflowers, she called the HOA office immediately. At first, I tried to dismiss it. She's just overzealous, I thought. But overzealous quickly morphed into relentless. Notices began appearing on my door. Fines for minor infractions that no one else seemed to face. A mailbox that was technically the wrong style. A swing set too close to the property line. It was absurd, but each fine came with the threat of legal escalation. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in the neighborhood thickened. Conversations at the block party were strained. Neighbors whispered behind hands and glanced nervously at my yard. I could feel the eyes of the community on me. But it wasn't just curiosity, it was judgment. The HOA had started to frame me as the problem, the one who disrupted harmony. Every interaction with Karen made it clear she was orchestrating this campaign with meticulous care. She seemed to thrive on control, on bending rules to suit her vision of the neighborhood, regardless of the impact on others. One afternoon, I returned from work to find a large orange notice stapled to my front gate. It was from the HOA, citing a new violation. Unauthorized landscaping alterations affecting community property lines. My heart sank. I had no idea what they were talking about. After carefully examining the notice, I realized they were claiming part of my backyard as community buffer space. Land that I had paid for and maintained for years. Karen had somehow convinced the board that my property wasn't entirely mine. The audacity left me speechless. I tried contacting the HOA office to dispute it, but every phone call ended with bureaucracy and vague threats of further fines or legal action. Emails were ignored. Letters piled up like a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, Karen seemed to appear everywhere. At the mailbox, near my driveway, casually observing as if she were a warden overseeing my daily life. The intimidation was subtle but pervasive, designed to make me feel vulnerable and constantly on edge. Desperation led me to document everything. I began photographing my yard, noting every communication, every fine, every meeting. I researched HOA law, reading dense legal documents late into the night, trying to find a loophole or precedent that would protect me. The more I learned, the more I realized just how much power a small group of people could wield, and how easily they could distort rules to serve personal vendettas. Karen's influence was clear. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was a strategist. And her strategy was to wear me down, to make me bend or surrender. Then came the incident that turned frustration into outright anger. One morning, I noticed heavy machinery parked at the edge of my property. A crew had been sent, apparently by the HOA, to survey the disputed area. When I questioned them, they insisted they had orders from the HOA and were authorized to inspect the land. I felt a rush of panic and fury. This was my home, my family's sanctuary, and now strangers were standing on it, claiming it was partially theirs. I called the HOA board immediately, demanding an explanation. The response was icy. We recommend you cooperate to avoid penalties. No apology, no clarification, just a cold, bureaucratic directive. The harassment escalated. Fines multiplied, now targeting things that were clearly ridiculous. Unauthorized decorative stones. Improperly trimmed shrubs. Imminent threat of aesthetic disharmony. Each notice carried the implicit threat of legal action, escalating tension at every turn. The stakes weren't just financial, they were emotional. My evenings were consumed by anxiety, pacing the yard to ensure nothing was out of place, feeling the invisible gaze of Karen and the HOA watching my every move. Sleep became fragmented. The weight of the conflict seeped into family life, casting a shadow over dinner conversations, birthday parties. even simple walks around the neighborhood. I started to notice patterns in Karen's behavior that made my blood boil. She had a way of presenting herself as a concerned, polite neighbor while quietly fueling the HOA's obsession with my property. During community meetings, she smiled and nodded, asking innocent-sounding questions that subtly undermined my position. Each comment was calculated, planting doubt in the minds of other residents about whether I was following the rules. It was psychological warfare. I felt trapped in a game I hadn't agreed to play. By this point, I knew that something had to change. Passive compliance was no longer an option, but I also realized the fight would not be simple. Karen had allies on the board. The HOA had power, authority, and precedent on its side, or at least the appearance of it. And yet, despite the intimidation and mounting fines, I felt a spark of determination I hadn't anticipated. I had invested too much, loved too deeply, and endured too long to let this neighbor manipulate my life and property. Then came the cliffhanger that would set the stage for the ultimate confrontation one evening. As I returned from running errands, I found a surveyor standing in my front yard, clipboard in hand. He had a map showing a proposed expansion of the community park, clearly overlapping with my backyard. A hand-drawn diagram, signed by the HOA president, suggested that my property line was under dispute. My stomach sank. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was about ownership, control, and power. Karen had taken her campaign one step further, attempting to expand the neighborhood, literally, onto my land. I stared at the paper, heart pounding, realizing that the battle I had been reluctantly drawn into was about to reach a level I wasn't prepared for. And in that moment, a chilling thought hit me. If I didn't act fast, if I didn't find a way to fight back, I might actually lose the ground beneath my feet. Not just metaphorically, but physically, legally, irreversibly. The countdown had begun. The morning the legal notice arrived, I felt a hollow mix of dread and determination. It wasn't just a letter this time. It was a stack of documents, stamped and signed by the HOA's lawyer, outlining fines, community encroachment claims, and a demand for immediate relinquishment of part of my backyard. As I sifted through the paper, a cold fury took hold. Years of small, passive compliance had led to this audacious claim. My property, the very foundation of my home, was under threat. It was a surreal moment. The kind that makes you question reality. How could someone, an HOA, or a single vindictive neighbor, think they could simply rewrite ownership laws to suit their whims? Karen's face flashed in my mind. Her smug smile. The way she floated through neighborhood meetings, feigning concern, while orchestrating the entire campaign against me. I realized then that this wasn't about beauty standards, fences, or flower beds. It was about power. And she had underestimated me. I spent the next hours meticulously reviewing the documents, cross-referencing property maps, legal precedents, and HOA bylaws. Every clause she cited, every fine issued, had a loophole, a procedural misstep that the HOA hadn't noticed. My pulse raced as I realized that, for the first time, I had the upper hand. Years of harassment had forced me to prepare for a battle I hadn't anticipated, but now the arsenal of evidence was mine. Photographs of my yard over time, recorded communications, the HOA's own inconsistent rulings, all meticulously organized. The confrontation would take place at the monthly HOA meeting, held in the community center's bland conference room. It smelled of stale coffee and plastic chairs, a setting utterly mundane, yet charged with an undercurrent of tension. Karen arrived early, clipboard in hand, radiating confidence, as if victory was already hers. She scanned the room, offering polite nods to board members, subtly reminding everyone of her involvement in shaping community standards. Every step she took, every glance was a performance. When my turn came to speak, I didn't falter. I laid out the evidence, point by point, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I detailed the timeline of notices, fines, and harassment. I presented property deeds, survey maps, and even expert opinions confirming that no HOA regulation had ever granted the board, or any member, the right to claim private land. I watched her expression tighten, the confident mask slipping, just slightly, as each piece of evidence dismantled her narrative. Board members, who had seemed unflinchingly loyal to her, began murmuring, glancing at each other with unease. The room shifted in energy. The veneer of authority she had relied upon was cracking. She attempted to interject, to argue procedural points, but I was prepared. I had anticipated every objection, every loophole she might exploit. I countered with legal citations, meticulous documentation, and an unwavering calm that surprised even me. At one point, she snapped, leaning forward, voice raised, attempting to intimidate me with accusations of community disruption and defiance of collective rules. The room fell silent. I held her gaze, feeling the full weight of the months of manipulation and harassment culminating in this confrontation. And then, with deliberate clarity, I dropped the final piece. A certified letter from the county confirming my property boundaries, accompanied by a legal opinion that explicitly stated the HOA had no authority over privately owned land beyond its own easement rights. Her face paled. The color drained, replaced with a mixture of disbelief and fury. For the first time, the room that had seemed entirely under her influence shifted. Board members, previously silent, started asking questions, probing the legitimacy of her claims, challenging her interpretation of bylaws. She tried to regain control, but her arguments were crumbling under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Each rebuttal she offered was met with calm but pointed corrections, dismantling the house of cards she had built over months. The tension was unbearable. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors, some astonished, some whispering relief. Karen's body language betrayed her panic. Her usual poised confidence had vanished, replaced by quick, shallow breaths and darting eyes. She was trapped in the very public spotlight she had sought to dominate, her tactics exposed to everyone in the room. Then came the turning point. I produced a timeline of her interference, dates, notices, fines, and meetings, showing a clear pattern of harassment. It was undeniable, and I presented it as such. The HOA president, who had previously nodded along to Karen's suggestions, cleared his throat and said something that stunned me. Given this evidence, it appears the board has been missiled. We will review all fines and claims immediately, and any further action against this property is suspended until proper legal review. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Karen's attempt to expand her influence, to weaponize HOA rules, had not only failed but backfired spectacularly. The atmosphere was electric. I could feel a mixture of vindication, relief, and lingering anger coursing through me. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral one, a public acknowledgement that manipulation and abuse could not stand unchallenged. But the climax wasn't over. Karen, sensing her collapse, tried one last gambit. She accused me of creating unrest in the community, suggesting that my actions had destabilized neighborhood harmony. The room fell silent again, all eyes on me. I looked at her calmly and said, without raising my voice, that standing up for one's property and rights was not only lawful, but necessary when faced with abuse of authority. There was a pause, pregnant with tension, before the board nodded, some with reluctant agreement, and others with visible relief that reason had finally prevailed. Her final gesture of defiance came as she stormed out of the room, slamming the door. The sound echoed like a punctuation mark on months of harassment, a dramatic exit worthy of the months long saga she had orchestrated. I stood there, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, knowing that the immediate battle had been won. But the emotional toll, the months of tension, the sleepless nights, had left a mark that wouldn't disappear overnight. As I stepped outside, the crisp evening air hit me like a bomb. The neighborhood, which had felt suffocating and hostile for months, seemed suddenly lighter. Some neighbors approached, offering quiet congratulations, while others simply smiled and nodded in solidarity. For the first time in months, I felt ownership, not just of my property, but of my agency, my voice, my right to live without fear of arbitrary punishment. That night, I sat in the backyard I had fought so hard to protect, staring at the trees and fences, the garden, and the space that had become the epicenter of months of conflict. The adrenaline still pulsed in my veins, but it was tempered now by a profound sense of clarity. I had faced the peak of absurdity, manipulation, and petty tyranny, and I had emerged not just unbroken, but vindicated. The HOA had been forced to step back, Karen's schemes publicly exposed, and my family's sanctuary restored. Yet, even in victory, there was a lingering question: how many other neighborhoods, homes, and families might face the same slow, insidious encroachment of petty power? How many Karen-like figures quietly manipulate rules and systems to satisfy personal agendas, expecting compliance and silence? That thought lingered like a shadow, reminding me that while I had won this battle, the vigilance required to maintain fairness and justice in one's own backyard was ongoing. I realized that the fight wasn't just about fences, flower beds, or property lines. It was about standing up when the system, designed to maintain order and harmony, is exploited to impose personal control. It was about the courage to document, prepare, and confront injustice, even when the odds seem stacked against you. And it was about the power of persistence. The small, consistent acts of resistance that build toward a decisive, undeniable victory. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, I allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. I had reclaimed my space, my rights, and my peace. But in the back of my mind, I knew this victory carried a lesson for anyone who might find themselves under the thumb of bureaucracy or petty authority. Preparation, patience, and persistence are weapons as powerful as any legal document. And in that moment, as I watched the shadows stretch across my reclaimed backyard, I realized that the next challenge, whatever form it might take, would meet a homeowner no longer intimidated, no longer passive, and fully prepared to defend what was rightfully theirs. The storm had reached its peak, but the eye had passed, leaving clarity, resolve, and a quiet, potent sense of justice in its wake. The days after the HOA meeting were surreal. The immediate tension that had dominated my life for months began to dissipate, replaced by an almost disorienting calm. The fines were officially rescinded, the property claim nullified, and the HOA issued a formal acknowledgement that my land was rightfully mine. Karen's aggressive campaign had been exposed for what it was: a manipulation of authority. A personal vendetta dressed up as community concern. Even the neighbors who had watched quietly from the sidelines seemed relieved. It was as if the community had collectively exhaled, realizing that fairness had finally prevailed. Yet, even in victory, life didn't instantly return to the idyllic quiet of the early days. There was a subtle, lingering tension, a residue of months of anxiety and conflict that had seeped into every corner of my home and neighborhood. Conversations with neighbors were polite, but the memories of whispered gossip and judging eyes still lingered. Even Karen's abrupt exit from the meeting didn't erase her presence entirely. For weeks, I would catch glimpses of her watching from her porch, a silent reminder that some people thrive on control, even when publicly defeated. I began to reflect on what had changed. Not just legally, but emotionally. The struggle had forced me to confront my own fears, my instinct to avoid conflict, and the temptation to stay quiet in the face of injustice. I realized that much of what Karen had counted on was my compliance, the belief that homeowners would bend to authority rather than challenge it. Once I stopped complying and started documenting, preparing, and asserting my rights, the balance of power shifted. That realization was empowering, a lesson I would carry far beyond the boundaries of my backyard. The impact extended into the neighborhood itself. The HOA, shaken by the exposure of procedural missteps and the public nature of Karen's campaign, began a slow process of self-reflection and policy revision. Board members who had previously accepted Karen's assertions without question were suddenly more cautious, more deliberate, and more accountable. New guidelines were drafted, emphasizing transparency and equitable treatment for all residents. I watched these changes unfold quietly, recognizing that my battle had inadvertently sparked a culture shift, one that would protect not just my property, but the rights of future homeowners. My own family felt the shift most profoundly. The tension that had hung over daily life, the constant worry about notices, fines, and intrusive surveys, was lifted. My children could play in the yard without fear of intervention. Weekends returned to their intended purpose: laughter, backyard games, and the occasional garden project gone hilariously wrong. We celebrated the small victories: the swing set properly installed, the flower beds flourishing without scrutiny, the simple pleasure of walking through the neighborhood without scanning for disapproving eyes. Yet the experience left a mark. I became more vigilant, more attuned to the fine print of HOA communications, and more confident in asserting boundaries. I developed an almost instinctive awareness of bureaucratic overreach, a preparedness that would serve me well in any future disputes. What had begun as a fight to defend my yard had evolved into a broader understanding of power dynamics, authority, and the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. Karen, on the other hand, receded into the background. The public nature of her defeat was a humiliation that she could not easily erase. Neighbors who had once deferred to her opinions now treated her suggestions with polite skepticism. The aura of influence she had cultivated over months collapsed almost overnight. And while she remained a presence in the neighborhood, her power, her ability to disrupt, intimidate, and manipulate, was irrevocably diminished. It was a subtle, yet satisfying, reversal of roles. The aggressor had become powerless in the face of persistence, evidence, and integrity. Interestingly, the legal aspect of the conflict didn't end with the HOA's acknowledgement. I had kept all documentation, photographs, and correspondence as a safeguard, and I consulted a lawyer to ensure no lingering claims could arise in the future. The attorney advised that while the HOA's acknowledgement was binding, having a formal record of the dispute, and my victory, was invaluable. It wasn't just about protecting my property, it was about sending a clear message: boundaries, legal or personal, cannot be violated without consequence. The experience also reshaped how I viewed community. I began to recognize that every neighborhood, no matter how serene it seems, has its own social dynamics, hierarchies, and potential for conflict. The difference between harmony and hostility often lies not in rules themselves, but in how they are enforced, and who wields the power of interpretation. I realized that vigilance, preparation, and the willingness to assert rights are crucial for maintaining fairness and protecting personal space. Over time, I found opportunities to share my story with other homeowners, initially in informal conversations and later in neighborhood meetings. People were eager to learn from my experience how to document interactions, understand bylaws, and protect their property. I became, unexpectedly, a resource for those who feared they might be the next target of overreach. Sharing the story wasn't about revenge or boasting. It was about equipping others with knowledge and confidence. The narrative that had once consumed me became a tool to empower others. As months passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the lessons endured. The HOA became more transparent. Meetings were conducted with more openness and accountability. Neighbors who had once been silent bystanders began speaking up, advocating for fairness and questioning overreach. The culture of passive compliance, the very culture that Karen had exploited, began to erode. My struggle had sparked a ripple effect that strengthened the community in subtle but meaningful ways. Personally, the victory restored more than just my property. It restored my confidence, my sense of agency, and my belief in the value of persistence. I realized that standing firm in the face of unreasonable authority is not an act of defiance for its own sake. It is an assertion of fundamental rights, dignity, and the principle that no one should be able to manipulate rules for personal gain at the expense of others. That lesson, I knew, would stay with me far longer than any fine or notice ever could. Looking back, the months of conflict now feel like a crucible that forged resilience. The late nights spent reviewing HOA bylaws, the anxiety-filled afternoons pacing the yard, the meticulous organization of evidence. All of it contributed to a profound sense of preparedness. I had faced the peak of absurdity, intimidation, and petty tyranny, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more assertive. The ordeal revealed an unexpected truth: the very challenges designed to intimidate and overwhelm could, when approached strategically and persistently, become opportunities for growth, empowerment, and lasting change. Even Karen's defeat served as a cautionary tale. The methods she had relied upon, subtle intimidation, bureaucratic manipulation, and personal vendettas disguised as community concern, proved ineffective when confronted with transparency, documentation, and reasoned argument. Her strategy collapsed under scrutiny, highlighting the vulnerability of power based on fear rather than fairness. For anyone watching, the message was clear: no amount of superficial influence can withstand a well-prepared, principled response. The backyard, once a contested battlefield, became a symbol of resilience. Each plant, each fence post, each patch of lawn carried the story of months of perseverance. Sitting there in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a deep satisfaction, not just for having defended my property, but for having reclaimed the peace, security, and joy that had been challenged. The yard, my home, and my family life were no longer under siege. The neighborhood, too, seemed to breathe a little easier. And yet, the experience left me reflective. I understood, more than ever, that the quiet battles of everyday life, property disputes, bureaucratic overreach, subtle intimidation, are rarely about the surface issues. They are about power, control, and the courage to assert one's rights. The conflict had started with a backyard and a set of petty rules, but it had evolved into a lesson about standing firm, documenting carefully, and facing intimidation head-on. The resolution was more than legal. It was personal, emotional, and moral. In sharing this story, my hope is that others recognize the importance of vigilance and advocacy. It is a reminder that even in communities that appear idyllic, challenges can arise, and preparation, persistence, and courage are essential tools. Every homeowner deserves to feel secure in their property, to enjoy their space without fear of arbitrary fines or intimidation. The power of knowledge, understanding your rights, documenting interactions, and preparing for confrontation cannot be overstated. The long-term impact of the ordeal extended beyond my household. The HOA's procedures improved. Neighbors became more attentive to fairness and less inclined to accept unchecked authority. Karen's influence waned, not through aggression or confrontation, but through exposure, accountability, and persistence. The entire community learned, in subtle but meaningful ways, the value of transparency, integrity, and assertiveness. Finally, there is a deeper takeaway, one that transcends property lines, bylaws, and fines. Life often presents challenges disguised as small, manageable irritations. A neighbor's petty complaint, a minor notice, a bureaucratic letter. Left unchecked, these can escalate, consuming time, energy, and peace of mind. But when faced deliberately, methodically, and persistently, even the smallest act of resistance can shift the balance of power. The story of reclaiming my backyard is, at its core, a story about standing up when it matters most, about refusing to be intimidated, and about transforming adversity into empowerment. As the seasons changed, my family and I continued our life on Cedarwood Lane with a renewed sense of security and pride. The flowers bloomed freely, the children played without anxiety, and the yard once again became a space of joy rather than contention. And in quiet moments, I would reflect on the months of struggle, realizing that the victory was as much about reclaiming peace of mind as it was about defending property lines. Looking back, I often ask myself, how many other homeowners silently endure petty overreach, intimidation, or manipulation? How many give in simply because they feel powerless or unsure? My story serves as a reminder that assertiveness, preparation, and documentation are not just legal tools. They are shields for dignity, peace, and fairness. The struggle may be daunting, but the reward is profound: the reclaiming of one's space, one's voice, and one's right to live free from unjust interference. And so, as I watch the sun set over a backyard finally at peace, I can't help but wonder. If one family can stand up and reclaim what's rightfully theirs, how many others might find the courage to do the same?